And get started. Everybody, welcome. Laura Belin from Bleeding Heartland is here, and she's going to talk about FOIA in Iowa because she's had a lot of experience with that. So please think of some questions to ask her as well. She has said that she'll have a lot of time for questions at the end just because she wants to answer them. So without further ado, Laura, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Yes, I could talk for a really long time about open records. So I have a few points. First of all, I just want you all to know you're already ahead of where I was. I did not have any formal journalism training, and I certainly never had any instruction in how to do a public records request. I started originally for about the first 10 years of my writing career, I covered Russian politics. There is no Freedom of Information Act or its equivalent in Russia. And so I just didn't, that was just not part of my experience. And when I started covering Iowa politics, initially I didn't have as much time for the in-depth reporting as I did later when my kids were a little bit older. So I just kind of stumbled through and learned a lot through watching other people and trial and error. So anyway, you're in great shape that you're already learning something. So the first thing I want to say is that to know the state law where you're working. So, I mean, people talk about FOIA, but FOIA is technically really for federal agency public records requests. And so in Iowa, the relevant part of code is called Iowa Code Chapter 22. You may be working outside of Iowa someday. I would definitely make sure that you know whatever the state law is. They can be very different. And if you're requesting records from a state government agency and you say something like, I'm sending you this FOIA, like they will immediately know that you aren't that familiar with the local terrain. So always try to cite, like I always try to start my records request, like under Iowa Code Chapter 22, I request the following public records, just so that it's clear. Learn from watching what other reporters are doing. I learned the most about this from people like Clark Kaufman of the Des Moines Register, Jason Clayworth when he was with the Register, Ryan Foley of the Associated Press. He's like an open records wizard. And just also, you can actually request from an agency, if you're assigned to a certain beat, like let's say you're a healthcare reporter, you can ask the State Department of Public Health to send you copies of any public records requests filed by other reporters or news organizations within a certain time period. And that will give you an idea of how other people word their requests. People do have somewhat different styles. And I know Tom Witowski, he worked for many years, was an investigative reporter at the Des Moines Register. He told me that he used to routinely sometimes just check to see what other people were up to. So he would just ask the governor's office or whatever to send him everything that other people had requested within the last week or two. So I don't do that routinely, but I do think that that can be helpful as a tool to see how other people are phrasing their requests. Also in Iowa, there's the Iowa Freedom of Information Council. They have a handbook, and on their website, they have some sample public records request letters. Other states may have similar organizations, and so that can be a good way to get ideas for how just the correct way to phrase things. I think it's important to request the format that you want the records in. I have had agencies try to just bury me in paper before. I mean, sending me hundreds and hundreds of pages of paper. The governor's office used to do this to me. Even when I requested the records electronically, sometimes they would mail me a big stack of paper. Of course, they know that's harder to put online. That puts the burden on me to scan whatever's interesting and put it online. So I try to always say, as part of my records request, something along the lines of, please, I'm requesting, or to minimize printing and photocopying and postage costs, I'm requesting these records in digital format and ask that you provide them to me via email or something like that. So in fact, during the pandemic, I started saying also, to facilitate social distancing, I'm requesting that you send these via email. Okay, this is the hardest part, I think. You don't want to be too broad or too specific in your records request, because if you're too broad, they'll come back and say, your request turned up to 20,000 emails and that'll cost you, thousands of dollars for the legal review. So, and if you're too specific, then you can miss things that are important. Like if you're too narrow with the keyword searches, there might be things that are relevant to the topic you're searching, but not all of the email messages maybe have the magic word in it. So I find that that's the most difficult. I mean, I just had a records request where I included the word terrace in something that was to the governor's office. And of course, not thinking that the governor lives at Terrace Hill. And so that was going to pull up like everybody's, um, every email message that said something about, that the governor was going to leave Terrace Hill at certain time, things that I didn't care about that weren't relevant. And I've had something similar. I'm trying to remember the agency where I requested something and one of the words that I used was a word that was in people's email signature. So that was just, they came back and said like that would be thousands of emails, but it's very difficult. I mean, I know that there have been times when I missed newsworthy things because the request was too narrow. So I find that that's the most difficult part. And talking to current reporters and retired reporters, they can give you a lot of guidance, I think, on this and their experiences with that. Don't request specific email addresses. This is really, really important. A lot of times, like if you know somebody's email address that they use at a state agency, and you might want all of the correspondence to or from that person within a certain date range, I don't ever put the person's email address. I always use the person's name. And one reason for that is was highlighted in this lawsuit filed a couple of years ago by Polly Carver Kim, who was the public records custodian for the Iowa Department of Public Health for about 12 years. Then she was fired a few months into the pandemic. And in her wrongful termination lawsuit, she described some what she viewed as open records violations. And she claims that she was fired because she was providing too much information. And one thing she said she noticed in April of 2020, so really right near the very beginning of the pandemic, was that the Iowa Department of Public Health had moved over to what was called like the Emergency Command Center that the Homeland Security Department runs in Johnston. They had key staff working out of that center. And they were all using different email addresses. I had no idea that these email addresses even existed, that instead of just like the person's first name dot last name at idph.iowa.gov or whatever it is, there were all these email addresses that started with ECC for Emergency Command Center. And so Polly Carver Kim could see that reporters were requesting lots of information and these ECC email accounts weren't being searched. So she raised concerns about that. And she alleges that that was one reason she was fired. And this case is still pending. So a judge or a jury hasn't made any determination on that. But I remember talking to reporters at the time, and I don't think anybody knew about these ECC addresses. So for instance, like if you wanted email to or from Sarah Reister, who was the deputy director of the Department of Public Health, and you wouldn't get anything that you wouldn't get any of the relevant messages. So another reason not to do this is just for my own personal experience. I used to use a different email account when I corresponded with, I had a different bleedingheartland.com email address because prior to 2019, I used to publish under a handle Des Moines Dem. So I had this email Des Moines Dem at bleedingheartland.com. And then I switched over to my current email, which is Laura R. Belin at bleedingheartland.com. But so if you asked, some state agency and you requested like all of their correspondence to or from Des Moines Dem at bleedingheartland.com, you would miss like everything that exists from the last 2 years. But if you asked for correspondence to or from Laura Belin, that everything should come up regardless of what email address I was using. So like I said, I see that, I have seen that often when I've looked at other people's records requests, but I just strongly advise using the person's name and not using an email account that you know of, because they may be using an address you don't know about. And then the last thing I'm going to say before I open it up, well, two more things. And this is kind of like, I don't know, I said, this is like pro strat level public records. I learned a few years ago from somebody who used to work in state government that I had at one point filed a records request and I had asked for emails to or from a person. And this person, this wasn't the subject of my records request, but it was somebody who had talked with a records custodian somewhere along the way, and that there was like some important email chain that I missed because the person I was asking about was copied on the message, but it wasn't a message to that person. Now, like, I would say that anyone who was copied on a message is a recipient of the message. So like, I think they should have provided that. But apparently the records custodian felt that since this message was not to that official or from that official, it was that, they didn't need to provide that email. And it was, so I was told it was something that was actually could have been useful to me. So now what I always do is if I do ask for correspondence to or from, like John Smith at the Department of Human Services, I then add an explanation that says, this includes all messages, whether John Smith was the sender, the original recipient, or CC'd on the correspondence. So I try to just like not leave them any wiggle room on that. I'm not saying that every records custodian would view that the same way, but like in my experience, they will be looking for loopholes to not provide you records if they can. So, and the last thing is follow up. I haven't always been good about this myself. I tend to get busy with a lot of different things. And so a lot of agencies will just try to slow walk your request and just not respond. That Iowa law doesn't tell them that they have to respond within a certain time frame. And so a month or two later, if you haven't heard, but you really shouldn't wait a month or two. But if you haven't heard anything within a week or two, definitely I would follow up and say, hey, was this received? Confirm receipt. And then if you haven't gotten the records within, a month or so, I think a month or two is a reasonable time frame, depending on how broad your records request is. If you're just requesting one or two things, they should be able to provide that right away. But if I've submitted some broad requests and I feel like it might take them a few weeks, but definitely follow up, because sometimes they're just counting on you not to follow up and then they win. If you forget about something, then they win. So, and following up can also be really important with, if you ever want to preserve the possibility of filing a complaint with the Iowa Public Information Board, which is a little bit useless. I mean, I'm not going to say that you're likely to get what you want from that board, but often like you have to file, they don't even have jurisdiction unless it's within 60 days of when you were denied such and such document. So if you don't notice, like if they sent you an email and said, well, actually, we think that that's confidential, and then you kind of forget about it and you realize it months later, it's too late for you to, if 60 days have passed since when they told you they wouldn't give you the records, it's going to be too late for you to do anything about it. So that is, I know that's hard. I'm not great about keeping things organized. I know that a lot of journalists will keep all their records request information in a certain spreadsheet, and then they have alerts sent to themselves or reminders so that they know to follow up on different requests. So that's a good practice. And I think that those are the main points that I wanted to talk about. But I feel like I could discuss any of those in a lot more detail or experiences, but I wanted to open it up because I know students always have good questions. So.
I have a question. Well, we have a couple people in here thinking of their questions, but I have a question. What would be your advice for students who are particularly dealing with, universities and stuff like that are government agencies technically, and can be difficult and stuff, but we're students and maybe we have the fear of some kind of academic, whatever. What would be your advice for us?
Oh, that's a great question. And I didn't experience that because, like I said, I wasn't a journalism student. So I don't know. I know that there have been a lot of really hard hitting student newspaper articles. And so I guess, I haven't heard about students suffering any academic reprisals. I'm pretty sure that would be illegal if a university tried to do that. I will say that at different times, I have found both Iowa State and the University of Iowa to be extremely difficult with public records requests. They are really not forthcoming. And I had the University of Iowa. Unfortunately, I lost before this was, I've only filed a couple of complaints with the Public Information Board in the last few years. And one of them was against the University of Iowa. And the board voted to dismiss my complaint, even though the staff of the Iowa Public Information Board thought my complaint was well founded. So it can be really difficult. And with universities, you do have to be persistent. I mean, I guess, I don't know, does your newspaper have like a legal counsel that you can ask about? Because I think that would be illegal for universities to do anything. So I guess my inclination would be to say, like, don't worry about it and just press ahead. And if anything happens, then I would really publicize that, because there are a lot of watchdog groups that would go nuts over that. And I think that this freedom, I mean, there's a growing awareness that freedom of information is important and is threatened. And I know that I was surprised a few years ago when I was trying to get credentialed in the Iowa legislature, and I still haven't been able to get credentialed. But anyway, that the first story that was written about it, it got picked up by a lot of media. Like, I didn't think that many people would care. I was even kind of surprised that the Associated Press wanted to do a story on it, but it got some national attention. So I think, like, if anything happened with a student here suffering any kind of retaliation over investigative reporting and public records, man, I think that would become a huge scandal that would probably get national attention. So I would say just definitely go for it.
Thank you. And also Eric asked a question in the chat that I think you just kind of touched on.
No, I can talk about it more. So
that'd be great.
I had very early on, I asked the University of Iowa for a bunch of communication between I don't know if you remember, but in the very early weeks, there were people at the College of Public Health in Iowa, at the University of Iowa, who wanted to help advise the State Department of Public Health on how to do things. And in early April, the State Department of Public Health and the university signed a contract that Brian Foley was the first to get hold of and publish, about this contract to do some kind of modeling, pandemic modeling, and also just advising. And the State Department of Public Health was going to share information about the COVID cases. And then anyway, so of course, what transpired was that the state didn't really do anything that these University of Iowa experts recommended. So I asked for correspondence between, I also asked for this correspondence from the Iowa Department of Public Health side, but I thought I was more likely to get it quickly from the University of Iowa side. So I asked for correspondence between, like, the Dean of the College of Public Health, the department chair of the Department of Biostatistics, Professor Joe Kavanaugh. He was the main person. He was like put in charge of the working group, and he was the main point of contact for the press. Like, when they announced that this working group was going to be advising the state agency, they said, like, these are the members of the working group, and that Joe Kavanaugh is the one to contact. So anyway, I had asked for a bunch of emails, and it took a few months. Honestly, I didn't get the emails until late July of 2020. So that was a little bit disappointing, but it was kind of a broad request, and they were getting a lot of requests during the pandemic. So I didn't file the complaint over an excessive delay in providing records. You can do that. You're not likely to be successful, but you can. So anyway, so there was one record in particular where Barbara Rodriguez, who was with the Des Moines Register, had asked Joe Kavanaugh a question about, there was some modeling that the college people had done, and they had sent it to the state, and she had questions about the modeling. And Joe Kavanaugh had emailed somebody with the Department of Public Health saying, I have these questions from a reporter, and here's what I'm planning to tell her, but let me know, like, if you have any suggestions. And then this whole big section of what he was planning to say to Barbara Rodriguez was blocked out, was redacted. And so then eventually, like, I got the email that was the reply from the Department of Public Health that said, well, we think that you should say this. Now, like, that part wasn't redacted. And I actually was able to get from Barbara Rodriguez later, I was able to get the email that she actually received. That's not a public records. That was just like a courtesy that she was nice and sent that to me. She was no longer even working at the Des Moines Register. She switched over to the 19th News. But in any case, she had saved some emails, and that was one of them. So I was able to see what he eventually wrote to her. But what I wanted to know was, what was it that he was planning to say to a reporter that the state, that somehow was redacted? And didn't think it was probably that important. So anyway, so I went back to the university and I said, hey, why is this redacted? Like, I think that you should tell me this. And they said it was redacted under an exemption. There are like 70 plus exemptions to the open records law. And one of them is for drafts. So they said that this was a draft. And I really didn't think it was, because he wasn't an employee of the Department of Public Health. I mean, it wasn't like an employee of the Department of Public Health said, I've drafted a report on something, but it's not the final version. Like, that would be, I could see that they would redact that, but I didn't really see, to me, this wasn't a draft. They weren't in a position. It was just as a courtesy, he was asking the state people, what do you think about this if I respond this way? But they weren't in a position, they didn't have authority to tell him what to say. And then the university also said that Joe Kavanaugh that it was a draft because he wasn't like a communications person. He wasn't like the communications director or whatever they call it. I can't remember whether the person is called public information officer or what they're called at the University of Iowa. But I mean, he was literally listed as the media point of contact for questions relating to this modeling cooperation agreement. And he had been quoted many times in the media. He had given me quotes. He had been quoted in the AP and the Cedar Rapids Gazette and the Des Moines Register. So clearly he was authorized to speak to the media. So I didn't think that that was legitimate. So anyway, I took this to the Public Information Board, and this is one of my frustrations about the board, is that so the board recommended, the first hurdle is the staff recommend whether to even accept the complaint or just reject it. And if they think it's legally sufficient to investigate, they accept it. And it's a really low bar, right? I mean, it's like you might miss it if it's more than the 60-day window, or if you're asking for something that obviously isn't in the purview of the, for instance, like the governor's office. The Public Information Board doesn't have any jurisdiction over the governor's office. So if you filed a complaint that said the governor's office withheld such and such, like, they would tell you they can't accept that because they don't have any jurisdiction to investigate. But in this, usually, like, if it's anything reasonable, they will accept your complaint. Well, initially, the chair of the Public Information Board didn't even want to accept my complaint. And I thought it was really inappropriate, because during the meeting, like, she was kind of thinking out loud, well, maybe they didn't provide it because of this or because of that. And it's like, it's not your job to think of other justifications for them to not provide the record. This is what I was told, that they weren't providing it under this drafts exemption. And I didn't think that this drafts exemption applied to the situation. And so anyway, so the staff had to then resubmit the recommendation that the board even accept my complaint for investigation. And that had to come before the Public Information Board, like 3 times before they even accepted my complaint as legally sufficient, which was ridiculous. So I kind of knew I probably wasn't likely to succeed, but I thought, well, maybe. So the staff, once it was finally accepted, the staff then did an investigation. And they often, what happens with this board is they propose an informal resolution. And in this case, the informal resolution was like the university provided the disputed record to the board, and there was going to be something where they would like paraphrase or provide a summary of what it was without providing the actual record. And I agreed to that resolution, but the university didn't. So that was a delay, because the university was like, no, we want that. We don't agree with it. So the staff ended up coming up with a recommendation that they felt that my complaint was well-founded and that there was probable cause to believe that the university violated Chapter 22. And then they brought that before the board. And there were some issues. There was some unclear wording. I can't remember the specifics, but there were some things that some board members didn't like about the way that was worded. So then that went back to staff again, and there was another month delay. But when it finally came up for a vote on the board, I think there are 9 members of the board, and I think one of the seats was vacant. And they voted like 6-2. My memory of it, I'm sure I have notes somewhere, is they voted like 6-2 to dismiss my complaint, even though the staff thought my complaint was well-founded, which a lot of times, if you watch their meetings, the staff recommend dismissing the complaint. So I felt like, if I got by the staff saying that there was probable cause, that they should have acknowledged that. But in any case, so the University of Iowa won that, and I was never able to see that record, exactly what was redacted. And I don't know, I kind of doubt there was anything really explosive in there. It was suggested to me, and I know reporters who have done this, that if they're denied a record, sometimes they just go to the person and say like, hey, can you show this to me? And I didn't want to put Professor Kavanaugh in that situation, even though he's tenured. I just felt like, technically I could have gone to him and said, what do you think about showing me this one email that you sent on one day? But like I said, I just didn't want to do that because I felt like that could cause issues for him. And also I felt like it was unlikely. I thought that the university was probably going to the mat on this because they didn't want to set a precedent that they would release this kind of information. But I kind of doubted, based on the way he replied to Barbara Rodriguez, which again, I got from the reporter, not from the university. I thought it was kind of unlikely that there was anything really major in that. So, but that would be like a nuclear option that you can do. And I have heard of people doing this, like some records that might be confidential, like birth certificates, or where you can't get all of the information, that they might go to the person and just say, you know what, the government agency won't give me this, but it's important for the story I'm working on. And like, you have it because it's in your family. Like, will you show me a copy of it? So that can be a way to get around. Like I said, that I consider that like a nuclear option, going to other people who have the records. But I mean, Iowa State was very difficult during the whole airplane scandal with the former president of the university. I know that there was a case, Ryan Foley, I was following it through the Public Information Board. There was a case where he was requesting certain emails related to when the governor was a student, when she was finishing up her degree at Iowa State. And that was held to be confidential under what is it, FAPSA, the privacy, or FERPA. FAPSA is the student financial aid, but FERPA is the student privacy one. So the university didn't give that to him because it would reveal specific information about a student. And so that was, I think because she was a public figure, I feel like she should have had less protection, but technically she probably was protected under that law. So anyway, yeah, that was a long answer to your question, but it was a really long thing. And it put me off submitting some things that I thought about filing a complaint with the Public Information Board. I just thought, well, it's so unlikely that I'm going to get the resolution I want that I'm just not even going to do that. Now, Clark Kaufman, he files a lot of complaints with them, even though some of them get dismissed, because he feels like he just wants to make a point and he wants to get them on record, even if his complaint is dismissed. So that's also a valid perspective. Oh, I see the question in the chat. Please share the process you follow from story idea to finished product as it relates to public records. Do you ask for the records before filing the FOIA? No, I wait. I try to do as much research as I can without filing the public records request, to try to figure out exactly what I need, so that I don't make mistakes of being too broad or too narrow. And so I tend to put a lot of thought into how I word the public records request. So there may be some times where I just ask if there's just like one letter, like I don't know, a federal agency said something to a state agency, I might ask the communications person, like, can you send me a copy of that letter? Because sometimes they'll do that. If it's very specific, they'll do that without making you go through the public records process. But I know I had a funny experience. It wasn't funny, but it was in retrospect with the Department of Revenue, where, like, again, it was one document, and I knew they were providing it to other reporters because one of the other reporters sent me a copy. But like, just as an experiment, I was like, hey, John, can you send me a copy of this? That I knew he was just sending to other reporters, and he like held it up for 2 weeks before he sent it to me. So I very rarely just ask for a record from the communications person. I've had the Department of Public Health where if I just am asking for a copy of one thing and they tell me I have to go file an open records request. So usually I don't even ask for it. I just try to figure out the records I need. And then I try to be careful in wording the records request. And that can take a long time. I mean, I can spend a lot of time, and I still sometimes make mistakes in how I worded the request, but I can spend quite a while working on those. Oh, yes, the state ombudsman's office. Yeah, I did see that report. I kind of regret that. I wanted to write about that report, and it just happened during a time when there was a lot of pandemic news, and I never got a separate post written about that ombudsman report, but it was, and the person who was very involved in that at the ombudsman's office, Bert Dahlmer, is a former Des Moines Register investigative reporter. So he takes this very seriously. And um, yeah, that was a good report. And I mean, if anything, understated some of the problems that there are, but they did really he really did get into a lot of the issues. I wish I had written about that. Maybe someday I'll find a way to circle back to that. Okay, do you think FOIA should be updated now that some requesters use it for nefarious intentions? Uh no, um I mean, everybody, I don't think the motivation is relevant. I mean, like with Watergate, I mean, Deep Throat, he didn't have the right motivations for why he was leaking information to Woodward and Bernstein, but it was still information to get out there. And um, even though I have to be careful what I say about this, but like the Alan Ostergren, who's the attorney involved in these objections to the various candidate petitions, he wanted Rob Sand, state auditor, to recuse himself from the state panel that decides on candidates because Alan Ostergren sued the state auditor's office last summer over withholding some records. And a spokesperson for the state auditor called Alan Ostergren a political hack. But it's like, whether you think he's a political hack or not, I mean, he has the same right to use the open records law as anybody else. So, and I think that if you work in government, like you should just assume that anything you write is a public record. I certainly assume, and I have had people ask for other people have asked for my correspondence with state agencies, and I take it as a given that anything I send to any government official is potentially a public record. And I mean, there may have been times when I said something unguarded in some email to somebody, but I try to be really careful because if somebody wanted to try to take me down for some, allegedly inappropriate communication or something with a government official, like that would be completely fair game for them to do that. And I feel like the open records law, regardless of the reasons, I mean, Jacob Hall of the Iowa Standard is someone who I think um, doesn't always have ethical intentions behind some of the stories he writes, particularly as it relates to education and LGBTQ issues in education. But nevertheless, like when he requested information from some school district, I think it was Linn-Mar, related to their transgender awareness week or whatever they did, and he requested the information and they tried to charge him thousands of dollars for it. I mean, that wasn't right. He has a right to that information. And even if he then later uses it unfairly and takes things out of context, like I don't condone, like if he ends up writing something in an unethical way, but that doesn't mean that the open records law should prevent him or anybody like him or people working for a campaign from requesting records. I mean, I'm sure that opposition people have filed lots of requests to try to get at records that Rob Sand or Tom Miller or Mike Fitzgerald have used, and hopefully they would be careful in how they use their government communications. And if there's something scandalous in there, like it's fair game, it's an open record. So yes, the state court system. Yeah, I've never had a problem. I don't do a lot of live coverage of hearings, but both with Polk County courts and with state court, I have never been denied permission to cover a court event. I've never actually, when I was going through right before the pandemic, as part of my effort to get credentialed by the state legislature, I asked for credentials from the University of Iowa to cover a sporting event. This was an idea I got from a retired journalist. Always talk to the retired journalists. They're great resources. And this person said, you should try to get the University of Iowa to credential you for something. And then you could say like some state government entity already credentialed you. So even though I don't do any sports writing, like I went up there, I got my press pass, I went to the women's basketball game, and I went to the press conference afterwards, and I asked a question of the coach. Haueter about, there was a bill pending in the legislature in 2020 that related to allowing student athletes to be compensated. So I had like an actual news question, and I never ended up writing the story because the pandemic blew up that session and the bill never went anywhere. But in any case, so so I did, yeah, I really haven't had issues other than with the governor's office and with the state legislature. Other than that, I haven't had issues. And certainly I haven't had problems with the courts in terms of denying me access.
I have another question.
Mhm.
If you could tell us like the most insane or ridiculous like open records experience you've had so far.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to think. There have been so many. Well, okay, this is probably the most insane one. So and it relates to Iowa State University. So I filed a lot of open records requests during that airplane scandal, and they were difficult. They released a lot of records. They kind of tried to bury us all. They released a lot of material, and then they were withholding like certain types of, and there was some material that even used to be online, like Ryan Foley got hold of it before they took it down, and then they took it down and they were denying access to it for other people. But anyway, there were some specific plane trips that were not fully explained. So, and there was one where on March 12th of 2016, I think, the plane was used to fly Stephen Leith and his wife down to North Carolina, where they had a vacation home, like right at the beginning of spring break. And then the commercial pilot who was on staff, turned around and flew back. So the question was this a personal use of the plane? It really looked like one. And this university's position was that the pilot was doing this as some kind of training, which is ridiculous. When they do a training flight for their certification, they just go up, they fly around for 45 minutes, they come back down. They don't like fly to North Carolina and fly back. So I got a tip from somebody that Stephen Leith had actually had the pilot bring back a dog, like fly Leith and his wife down to North Carolina, and then on the return trip, carry a dog back in the plane. And I didn't know who the dog was for or whatever. I mean, I felt that it was a credible tip. And I should emphasize that I was never able to confirm this. I believe that I believe that it's likely that this happened. So anyway, so I filed a request. First of all, I asked the president's office, like, how many dogs did the president and his wife have, and how old were the dogs, and how long had they had the dogs? And I was told, like, they hadn't had the dog, they hadn't acquired a new dog in 2016. So then I thought, well, maybe he's a big hunter. So I thought, anyway, maybe he like had a dog breeder he knew in North Carolina, and he had the plane bring back a dog for some friend or contact at Iowa State. So I filed a records request, and I thought if this happened, it was likely that Stephen Leith probably used private email to set it up. But I thought, well, he might have made a mistake. Sometimes people make mistakes using their official email. So I asked Iowa State for like all emails to or from Stephen Leith within a certain time frame that was like November of 2015 to through March or April of 2016 that contained the words dog or puppy, and there might have been like a few other words in there. And Iowa State came back and they said there were like 300 emails that met the criteria. And I was like, okay, well, I'll pay. They said it would cost $120 to review all of those emails. And I was like, yeah, I'll pay $120 because I thought this would be like a blockbuster story if I could confirm this. So, so I paid the $120, and they literally sent me the records on Christmas Eve. This is a classic government agency thing. Like they send you records like at 4:56 p.m. on a Friday, or like on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, or like the late in the day right before July 4th weekend. So this is a classic thing that everybody can tell you about. So they sent me the records literally on Christmas Eve, and so there was nothing in there that confirmed any kind of dog or puppy being transported in the University of plane. And there were only 2 or 3 emails that were even like actual personal emails where he mentioned a dog to somebody. And almost all of them were like, he had set up Google News alerts with headlines, and he must have used dog or something as one of his keywords. So almost all of them were just like Google headlines, and somewhere there would be some story that mentioned a dog. And so I complained to the university afterwards because I was like, this is ludicrous. When they did their search, they must have realized that the vast majority of these emails were just Google headlines and didn't require any kind of legal review. And yet they charged me on the basis of like that they were actually going to be reviewing 300 emails. And so they actually refunded $90 out of my $120. So they charge like $30 for the first hour or something. A lot of agencies will give you 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours for free, and then they start charging you per hour. So I know that there have been some agencies that have hardly ever charged me anything because they usually say that it didn't take more than X number of hours. But anyway, so that's probably the most ridiculous. And the other thing that was funny about it was that Stephen Leith gave an interview to the Des Moines Business Record during this period where he was like, it's so unfair. Like, I'm just being targeted with all these personal attacks. And like someone was even asking about my dog and like making it sound like this was this, really over the top. And it was like, I had a legitimate journalistic reason for asking about the dog because I had a credible tip that he used the university airplane to transport a dog for some kind of personal use that obviously wouldn't be university business. So anyway, so that was but I didn't want to say anything at the time that he gave this sob story interview because other than just to say to people, look, this was a legitimate request that I filed. I remember Ryan Foley saying, did you file that request? Because he didn't file it. He was trying to figure out who was asking about the dog. Anyway, so that's probably the most ridiculous.
Funny. We have time for one more question. Does anybody watching have a question? If not, oh, there you go.
Oh, the Assange Snowden route. Okay, well, I've never had somebody in government like offer to leak me information. I'm awkward. I guess I've never been working on a story of that huge interest, like, a matter of literally national security or foreign policy. So that is tough to say. I have not asked government officials to illegally provide information. I have always tried to go through the legal channels. And part of that is just that, I don't want to get people fired. And the other thing is that as I'm trying to get credentialed myself, I don't want to open things up and have people say, well, you don't follow all the rules. So I've always tried to follow, like every time the Iowa House changes its media access policy, I always try to jump through all the hoops so that I can demonstrate that I'm in compliance with their policy, even though it never makes any difference because they don't credential me anyway. But I always try to show that I'm doing things the right way. But I don't think it's illegitimate for somebody necessarily to leak information. I mean, I respect like what Reality Winner did. I thought it was atrocious that, she ended up spending as much time in prison as she did. And I do understand that. And, for a story, like I said, I haven't been working on a story like that I could really, but I have not personally asked people to illegally provide documents that I wasn't able to obtain. I've always just tried to obtain them through the regular legal route. It is frustrating though, the stonewalling. I mean, they do, and I feel like also, one thing that frustrates me is if I do get a scoop based on public records requests, and it doesn't always get a lot of attention in the other media. And sometimes that's because maybe what I'm writing about is a little bit inside baseball, but there have been times when I felt like I reported out an important story, an exclusive, and if it doesn't get any attention, I feel like that really rewards the state agency stonewalling, because if other journalists start asking, the point where I get the records and I ask follow-up questions and then I can't progress the story further because I can't get answers to any of the questions. So if other people would ask the questions, they might have better access and they might be able to get something out of it. But so, I mean, that's a frustration that I've had that is more, I guess, a frustration of the media rather than the agency. But so I feel like there should be more solidarity, I think, with journalists. Like if somebody has a big scoop, then other people should follow up on it when they can.
Thank you so much. That is all that we have time for today.
Okay.
It was really awesome. We recorded this session, so it will be, I'm assuming we'll just post it on the First Amendment Day's website, so everybody can have access to it. I see Laura put her email in the chat.
That's it. If anybody thinks of questions afterwards, just email me. I'm always happy to answer questions. So
awesome.
it's fun. Good luck. Yeah, but go after them. At least Wendy Winterstein isn't using the plane for private purposes, but I mean, I'm sure there are lots of other stories that you can dig up. I haven't kept my eye on Iowa State as much since the whole pandemic started. So, but yeah, be fearless and go out there. And Randy Evans of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council is a really great resource. So don't hesitate to ask him questions. I know that he's very generous with his time for people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Everybody have a great rest of your day. Make sure to attend the other First Amendment Day sessions. All right.
All right. Have fun. Good luck.
Thank you.